plow ahead with the Gospel of Luke. So we're going to spend some time today in a very interesting place. If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn it to Genesis chapter 22. This is where we will be spending our time. For me, I can't speak for anybody else in this room, but I can tell you for me, and I'm ashamed of this, but this is how it is. These events arrive on the church calendar. You can go to the internet and you can print a whole church calendar for the whole year. And of course the months of March and April are just filled. Every day has some very significant stature in the way that the days pass. And of course this is the week where Jesus is coming to Jerusalem, and he's going to be in Jerusalem for this week, which is moving him toward Good Friday when he's going to be crucified. That's the process. But I have to say, and I'm sorry about this, I really am. I'm not saying this to be dramatic. I wish that I could really feel these things the way they are in the Scripture. The intensity of Palm Sunday, the intensity of Jesus' heart as he comes to this moment knowing what's coming. And I just can't. I wish I could. But there's a biblical comparison I want to make today, and that's between Jesus and what he chose and what Abraham chose in his time. Let's take a look at this text. I'll begin reading in verse 1 of Genesis chapter 22. Sometime later, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham." Abraham said, "Here I am." God said to Abraham, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I'll tell you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up. He saddled his donkey. He took with him two of his servants and his son Isaac. When he cut sufficient wood for the offering, he set out to the place that God had told him to go. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He looked at his servants and said, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there to the mountaintop. We will worship, and then we'll come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, placed it on his son Isaac's back, placed himself with him, carrying a knife, carrying the fire, and the two of them went on together. Isaac spoke up and said to his father. Abraham replied, "Here I am, yes, my son." "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where's the sacrifice? Where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide. The lamb will be provided for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told Abraham about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed Isaac on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took his knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called from heaven and said, "Abraham!" He probably called a lot louder than that. "Here I am," Abraham replied. "Don't lay a hand on the boy," the angel said. "Don't do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you've not withheld from me your son, your only son, the son you love, Isaac." Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught in the bushes by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son Isaac. So Abraham called the place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided," because of these things. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you've done this, you've not withheld your only son from me, I will bless you. I'll make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as numerous as the sand grains on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of your enemies, and through your offspring all the nations on the earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." And then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. What in the world is the purpose for this test? I mean, I cannot capture in my mind what this was like for Abraham. You know, I'm a dad, so it's hard for me to relate to it from the point of Isaac. But from the dad's side, I can kind of feel this a little bit. What was the purpose? I mean, God had selected Abraham, and Abraham had obeyed him. He'd already gone west. You know, he left his home in Ur, and he'd come way down west and south. He was already being obedient. So why would God ask Abraham to make this incredible sacrifice here like this? And this whole process, this is what fascinates me about these kinds of things in the Bible. The whole process hinges on very small things. The whole process of the success of this hinges on Abraham saying yes. If he says no, this doesn't happen. We don't have this narrative in the Bible. If Abraham says, gosh, Lord, I don't think so. I don't think I'm going to take my son out there, the only son you've given me to have, and slay him. Now, could Abraham have chosen otherwise? That's a real question for some. Calvin would say no. Calvin is mistaken. I'm sorry about that, but I have to say I disagree with Calvin entirely, because if Calvin is right and Abraham had no choice but to do this thing because God had commanded him, then that means this is not obedience. This is merely what Abraham had to do. In order for it to be obedience, Abraham had to choose it. And so Jesus is doing the same thing. In the scripture, if you read the gospel, there comes a point 1 week out where Jesus the text says he set his face like flint to go to Jerusalem. Meaning the disciples, you got to know that they all knew that when Jesus got back to Jerusalem, there was going to be trouble, because they know what the Jewish officials are doing. They know that the Jewish officials want to take Jesus out. They don't like what he's saying. They want to see him killed. Remember, he raises Lazarus from the dead, and what does the text say? The Pharisees plotted together how they might kill him. What kind of logic is that? That you see this guy come out of the tomb alive, why would you not just run to Jesus and say, Jesus, we believe you are the Son of God, you're the Messiah. No, let's figure out how we can kill him. That's how darkened hearts work. We think about these people that go into schools and shoot people up. How can they do that? That's how they can do that. And you know, the line between good and evil runs through every heart in this room. Nobody's immune to it. So Abraham believes God, and the text says God reckoned it to him as righteousness. Right? He comes to him, shows himself to him, has the covenantal cutting of the animals and walking through them and all of that. But at every step of that, Abraham has to believe, and he has to make little choices every time. God confronts him, he makes a choice. God confronts him, he makes a choice. And I love the way this text goes, because you see the way the writer, Moses, ramps up the energy here. Take your son, your only son whom you love. It just gets more and more and more intense as this moment comes. And it's almost like, in a way, I look at it and I say, if that's the conversation, and I believe it is, that God had with Abraham, God's just going to make it as hard as possible. He's just going to keep working Abraham over, massaging Abraham until Abraham is so utterly broken by this moment that he's got to be obedient until it's very hard for him. Why this test? What does it signify? Well, you and I have been in Sunday school, right? I mean, we all grew up. We remember seeing the Sunday school books with the color pictures that were drawn there of Abraham with that thing they wear and down on his back, and the donkey and the wood, and Isaac walking next to him with lots of curly black hair and talking. And we've seen that, right? And then we see Abraham with the knife, and we see the angel grab Abraham's hand in the pictures, and we know what it means. What it means is don't withhold from God, right? And that's true. That's part of the message, but that's not all of it. That's not all of it at all. This is something so outside of me. Maybe I'm the only one. So outside my experience that I cannot relate to it. You remember Abraham prayed for a son, and he was praying for an heir. Now, I'm a 20th century person. Think hard for just a moment. Do we really, as parents, as fathers especially here, since it's Abraham, but mothers too, do we really have that sense of urgency about our line going on? I got to tell you, I'm sorry, but I don't. I don't look at life that way. I'm thankful that Jackson is here. But I'm not thinking to myself, the line of the Snows goes. It doesn't even occur to me. It was a big deal for them. It was a big deal for them. I mean, if God had said, Abraham, I want you to go out and I want you to get one of your servants to sacrifice you, that would have been easier than what God asks Abraham to do here, to take that son that he's prayed for, he and Sarah, the only son they've got, and to sacrifice him. I think about Mary, and I've used this imagery before, maybe use it next week, I don't know, it depends on whether I forget about what I said here today. But I just think every Easter I think about Mary, and I think about toddlers. When you reach down in a toddler, those little soft, warm hands, man, they just, there's nothing like that. When you pick them up and those little hands go around your neck, I'm telling you, we were built for that. There is nothing like that in the whole world. And then I think about Mary seeing the little feet, the little feet that she probably washed 1,000 times, those little squared up toddler's feet with the perfect little toes and everything else that she probably washed 1,000 times. And she's going to watch Romans drive spikes through the wrists and through his feet. I just can't imagine it. So a question emerges here for me. What does this mean? I mean, is one of the things, I'll tell you this, with the atheists with whom I correspond, this is one of the things they stumble over, this narrative. How could God be good and ask Abraham to do this? Does God enjoy human sacrifice? He seems to, according to the way the atheists would read this. And in the first century, there was a movement in the church right away, right after the church started, called Gnosticism. And there was a man who came right after Paul named Marcion, who said, all of that stuff in the Old Testament is so bloody and so ugly, we're going to get rid of it. The only thing that matters is the New Testament. He just took bits and pieces of that and made his own Bible. It was because they could, in other words, what the atheists are complaining about today is very, very old. That complaint is very, very old. It's hard. It's hard for us to look at stuff like this and appreciate what it really means. Well, what does it mean? I mean, look at it this way. Ask yourself some very logical questions. Let's ask ourselves that. Does God not know that Abraham loves him? I mean, he's God, right? I mean, he probably does. He probably knows the answer to that question. Does God not know that Abraham will do this thing because God asks him to? Well, yeah, he probably does. He probably knows Abraham's going to obey him. So who's the beneficiary? Who's the beneficiary here? It wasn't God. God's not going to benefit from this at all. Even if the narrative had gone on, and thank God, and I say that sincerely, it doesn't go that way, Abraham had sacrificed Isaac. It's not for God. It's for Abraham. The obedience was for Abraham, and it was for Isaac. Can you imagine what a lesson that was for Isaac? My dad believes God so much that he would be willing to do that. And it was for the Jews, the Jewish nation who would come. This story, you can't be a Jew and not know this story. And then it was for us. It was for us. You see, there is such a tragic nature within the Old Testament, and I think it's intentional. I don't know how it is for you. Now you're going to think, when you hear me tell this, you're going to think, Rip, you are mentally unstable. That's the first thing you're going to think. Something is wrong with you. But this is how I feel. In the summer, all of us who live in the South, we contend with gnats. Everybody knows what a gnat is. Now, people up above about Atlanta and further, they don't even know what a gnat is. I mean, I remember talking to people in Pennsylvania about gnats. What's a gnat? Well, we get down around Florida, they found out what gnats were. And they think, how can you stand this? The one little gnat doing like that, I don't even see it. Do you? I don't even think about it. But the guys I was traveling with, man, you would have thought it was a hornet that was buzzing in their face. They just could not bear the thought of these little things You and me, they're crawling around while we're eating. We don't even think about it. Well, you are going to think something's wrong with me, I promise. If a gnat lights on my arm, like you get a cut, you know how they like that, and I swat the gnat, I feel bad about that. I'm totally serious. Because I remember when I was a kid thinking about little bugs. That's a living thing. That is a thing that is alive. It moves on its own. It has certain things it does. It's able to fly. I can't fly. And when I do that, that life is gone. Now that means something to me. You may think something's wrong with me. That's okay. But it means something to me. And I think about the sacrifice system in the Jewish nation. They kept a flock of lambs, of sheep, 250,000 strong, near the temple, raised just to be sacrificed. And it was bloody. And they sacrificed 2 of them a day, 6 days a week. And can you imagine being a small child? I mean, I don't know. Surely people felt something when they saw that priest go through the oblations and say the things he said and then reach down with that knife and slit that little throat of that innocent little animal that had done nothing to deserve that moment in its life. I can't imagine that they didn't feel something. There's a tragic nature because you've got something very innocent that has to die in order that sin is paid for. That's incredible to me. I just can't relate it. And God didn't want, this is what nobody remembers when they think about the Old Testament and they think, oh, that's terrible. What kind of God is that? God didn't want any of that. They forget that part. God didn't want any of that. Remember Jephthah? He came, he was an outcast. And the leaders of the city said, you got to go get rid of these people. They're tormenting us. You're the military guy. You can defeat them. They go up and they strike a deal with Jephthah. They'll let him back into the circle of friendship of the Jews, and we'll make you a city official and all this stuff if you'll just help us get rid of these people. Jephthah does it. And Jephthah makes a kind of a pact and says, Lord, if you'll give me victory here, the first thing that comes through that door when I get back to my home, I'll sacrifice it to you in gratitude. And it's his daughter. Did God want Jephthah to do that? No. Should Jephthah have made that vow? No. He shouldn't have. You see, it reminds me of the same thing happened with poor old Peter. I feel sorry for Peter. I mean, can you imagine how you feel? Get behind me, Satan. I mean, you can say that to some of your friends. They're not going to be happy about that. And Peter, after all that had happened, when he denied Jesus, he comes to Jesus and Jesus says, do you love me? Ask him 3 times. And every time he asked him, he used a different word for love and kept lowering the bar. Can you imagine how Peter felt? Do you love me? You see, what is happening with Abraham is not a test to prove Abraham's love for God. It is not. It is something else. It is a natural outworking of devotion. And it's part of this gigantic story. The Old Testament is a gigantic story of God as a father pursuing his rebellious children from start to finish. And it culminates in just what's happening in Jerusalem today. That is Jesus coming into the city on a donkey. They throw the palm branches down. And Jesus comes knowing that none of this that's happened, this Mardi Gras party time atmosphere is going to change. He knows that when he comes. He knows the palm branches. Can you imagine? Think back to Abraham for just a minute and allow your imagination to think. What was it like when they're walking? You know, they travel to a spot and he leaves the donkeys and the servants and they start to walk because they can see off in the distance the place where God told them to go. And they start walking. Now, Isaac doesn't know what's going on, so he's just walking with his dad, asking him questions. Dad, where's the lamb? You know, you got everything else here. I don't understand. Well, there'll be one provided. But in Abraham, can you imagine every step, every second that passes, he knows is walking him closer to what he's supposed to do. And it's the same for Jesus. He comes in clippity-clopping on that donkey. He sees these people coming by. They're singing and shouting, Hosanna. Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. They're putting the palm branches down. It's just a party. But Jesus, as he sees every one of those faces go by, he knows what's coming. He knows what's coming. Very different for him. Paul says to you and to me, present your body as a living sacrifice. This is your spiritual service of worship. That's what he tells us. That's what he tells each one of us to do. Present your body as a living sacrifice. This is your spiritual service of worship. Man. And he says to Jesus the same. Jesus is going to come and sacrifice himself, but not because of himself. See, we just got it so backwards. We think about God. We think that God is punishing. We think that God is doing these things because there's something in... God doesn't have any needs at all. He has no needs. He doesn't need you. He doesn't need me. He doesn't need the universe. And he doesn't need us to do nice things for him. He doesn't need our money. He doesn't need our time. He doesn't need our lives. He does not need us. So why all of these things? Why these elements of sacrifice? Are they there just to make stuff hard? Or are they there just to satisfy some need in God? None of that's right. They are there because there's a way in which we were built to live. And that way is that we would live near to God. There's a way we have to get there. God's made a way. A way. Only one. Isaac knows this process. He's laying there. He knows what's going on. I can't imagine what's going in his mind when Abraham ties him up and then puts him up on top of the wood, the burnt offering wood. But these moments, all these moments are not lost to God, and they're not lost to us. There is something being said to us in every one of these moments. What is being said to us is God wants us. He wants us. He doesn't want us to suffer necessarily. He wants us to be near him so that you and I can flourish, that we can flourish as human beings. Look, it's just logical, right? If God exists, then he's the maker. If God exists and he's the maker, then what are we? We're the thing made. Well, what's the best place for the thing made to be? Near the maker. Near the maker. Palm Sunday is the process wherein you're seeing 3,500 years of choices come to a moment. There were 1,700 years between Abraham and Jesus. And you see 1,700 years of all the choices of all the characters in the Old Testament being brought to this one moment in time where Jesus is going to make a choice. He sets his face to Jerusalem. He comes into the city. He knows everything that's coming, but he chooses to come. I was reading in preparation for this, and I caught this really nice article. It made so much sense to me on this. And it's a good way to look at what happens during this week. Everybody knows who Renoir is. You may not know his paintings. I'm not a painting aficionado myself, but I've seen Renoir's paintings. I recognize a couple of them, the famous ones. Great painter. And there was a younger painter, another famous painter, Matisse. Matisse was much younger, kind of coming behind Renoir. He came into Renoir's studio, and Renoir at this point was very aged, and Renoir had rheumatoid arthritis. And so all his joints are swollen. His hands don't work the way they ought. He's holding the brush with these big old fat gnarly knuckles that he had because of the arthritis, and he's painting. And Matisse was in the studio watching him, and he just started to weep. He could not understand. Renoir, you're famous. You've got all the money you'll ever need. Nobody's requiring you to do this. Why would you put yourself through all of this suffering? And Renoir says, the suffering passes, but the beauty of the painting remains. The suffering passed for Jesus. The beauty of what he's done remains in you and me. We're still here. And God gives us a life to live, a life that's far better than the life we would know apart from him. That was provided for. We can choose. I don't know where everybody is today, but if anything I've said, you've got a question for me, you want to pray with me, talk to me about this church, talk to me about